Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters at P&T, welcome back to the show. As you know, I'm your host, Lee Vinsel. And, recently I've been feeling a little lonely behind the microphone here, which is why I've been reaching out to folks, hoping to find some co-hosts. And that's why we have my friend Paula Bialski here, my friend co-host with me today.
Exactly, but I wouldn't say you invited me. I thought I just invited myself on here, and you were just too polite to refuse. I just forced my way in the
I
door.
wasn't gonna tell people that about you, but I mean, I'm glad that you're willing to just have it all out there on the
I take
table.
no for an answer. Don't take no for an answer.
So, in case listeners haven't heard the episode you were on or don't remember it, can you just tell folks a little bit about who you are?
Surely, it's so wonderful to be here. I'm Paula Bialski, and I'm a science and technology studies scholar. I'm based here in Switzerland, so far away from Lee, covering other side of the pond. And I'm really thrilled to be here. And I really was a big fan of the show, and I just really vibe with you. I think, Lee, we don't know each other very well, but it's kind of like when you meet someone in the airplane and you just want to chat
Totally.
for hours and
Yes,
become BFFs. So this is my attempt
that's
to
it.
become your buddy by
You are my
co-hosting.
buddy. It's and it's funny. You're one of my. I have a handful of professional online only friends so far. I really hope we get to hang out in person someday. But you're definitely one of those folks.
It's like
We do vibe.
MySpace, like early
Yeah.
2000s, or ICQ, which
So
was pen pals.
we can tell the folks and give them the expectation. We're gonna actually do several episodes together, and I'm really looking uh, forward to that. But when we started playing with the idea of doing this, the first person, you kind of brought up was Gabriella Coleman, who is a full professor of anthropology at Harvard University, and has this long career of writing about hackers. And she's perhaps best known for her book on anonymous hacker, hoaxer, whistleblower, spy. Um, but yeah, why do you think of Biella as the first person that come to mind?
Yeah, I guess Biella's work is important to me not only because she kind of laid out a lot of the ground of what it means to anthropologically study people shaping our technology and really the people shaping our technologies.
Yeah.
It's not just the tech, it's really she looks at who the culture, the really at the ground level, and she does so with super rigorous anthro methods. She's really
Yeah.
there. She's there for it, right? She's shows up. She's there for years. This isn't just some little study. She really is super committed, becomes part of the community, and it's really inspiring. And she also turns to places that aren't always looked at, which we're also going to find out in the interview. I mean, she studies hackers, but she also studies mold, and she studies
Yeah.
also all sorts of spaces which we don't look at. And yeah, I think a lot of people are inspired by that for sure.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think for the show and also just kind of my own interests, I see her, we've done a series of episodes kind of on major figures in the field of technology studies. And one place I've focused is kind of what I think of as the first generation of digital technology ethnographers and studies people. So I've had Steve Barley on. I had Joanne Yates on, my friend. I haven't had Vonda Orlikowski on yet, but that's a big dream of mine. We'll see if I can make it happen. So that's first generation. But then I think I don't know if Biella's second or third, but I place her in the same kind of timeline with Dana Boyd and these other figures who are writing, maybe are just, I don't know, they're probably my age actually, but I feel like they've been writing publishing a little bit longer than I have, but I keep going back to their work recently, both for the show, but also for teaching purposes. And I just am really struck by how strong it is.
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, like, I don't think I always appreciated that at the time their publications were coming out, but I'm like, damn, this shit is just like empirically hardcore. They're doing the work, you know?
Exactly, and it's applied to all sorts of other fields, right? I also
Yeah.
like even in Anonymous, for example, when she looks at how humor works and how the idea of meme culture, and you can pull out, I don't know, dozens of other examples where her work is applicable to another space. So I think if
Yeah.
that's hopefully exciting for people who listen to today's show, that it goes beyond just the interest in hacking or
Right. We do joke about her move into critical mold studies, which she might end up working on.
I
The
think
only
she
other thing,
is.
yeah, I think she is working on it. And the only other thing I was thinking about is one of the themes of our conversation. This just I remember that I wanted to talk a bit about this is that, there was kind of this early hacker ethos is how it was talked about. Biella didn't talk about it like in a super narrow way like that. I think some people kind of over idealized way of talking about that. But one of the things she's really been tracking about is how the world of hacking has like broken into all these different flavors and subcultures at this point. And I think that one thing I wanted to kind of mention to folks is that we do talk a bit, we keep mentioning the dark enlightenment in this conversation. And I just wanted to let people know that you can check out the Wikipedia page on it if you're not familiar. It's also known as the neo-reactionary movement. It's this kind of anti-democratic, anti-egalitarian way of thinking about the world. There's important thinkers like Curtis Yarvin, this philosopher, or, maybe philosopher in quotation marks, but it's very influential with like Peter Thiel and these kind of tech folks. So if you're not familiar with that term, you might want to wiki it at some point, just because Biella has been kind of tracing how hacking ethoses have changed over time from this kind of cyber libertarian mindset to more like authoritarian reactionary ones. Yeah.
Yeah. So should I say yes, get excited? Is this the moment that I say get excited? Yes, get excited for this talk. Did I just ruin this entire intro?
No, that was fucking beautiful, man. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome to Peoples and Things, a podcast about human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel, an associate professor of science, technology, and society at Virginia Tech. Our guest host today is my buddy Paula Bialski, an associate professor of digital sociology at the University of St. Gallen in St. Gallen, Switzerland. A previous P&T guest and author of the great book Middletech, Software Work, and the Culture of Good Enough. Today, we'll be talking with Gabriella Coleman, professor of anthropology and associate in the history of science department at Harvard University and associate at the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. We'll be talking to her about her long career in the area of hacker studies, as well as some of the things she's been getting up more recently to, including possibly forming a new subfield known as critical mold studies. So we'll see about that. Biella, thanks so much for coming on and talking to us today.
It's so great to be here.
Yay.
Yay.
And thanks for letting me to creepily crash the party.
No, not at all. We're going to do more of this. I love having Paul on.
Oh.
So just to kick things off, Biella, when folks think about you, the first thing that comes to mind for many people is like hackers and the study of hackers. So, how did the subfield of hacker studies come to be? Where was it when you got into it? And how did you how'd you get into it?
So that was about 1998, 99, 2000 is when I started to kind of dive into the world of computer hacking. And at the time, there was, I would say, kind of two bodies of work. One was journalistic. Mm-hmm. So you had folks like Stephen Levy and Bruce Sterling, who, wrote these really fantastic, rich, and really quite ethnographic books on hackers. And then you had some folks in media studies as well, who were writing about hackers like Mackenzie Wark and others. But there wasn't a lot of really empirically driven work on computer hackers, and especially not ethnographic. And I don't think I would have done this work either had I actually not gotten sick, because there was sort of a lot of pressure for me to do a sort of traditional anthropology project, which focused on the sort of non-English speaking world, certainly not working in the United States or Europe among kind of techies. And I sort of had a side interest in free and open source software and computer hackers, and was, putting my toes into this world. But it was really because I got sick and was at home for a year and I had a pretty decent internet connection that then I really just started to learn more and more and more. And I could do actual research while just being at home. And then when I got better, I went to my advisors and sort of, suggested that maybe I should switch topics. They actually pretty much said no or discouraged it. And then I actually talked to a friend of mine who's Irish, and the Irish accent inspires me. And so she basically was like, no, I would kind of imitate it, but I can't do that very well. But she was like, no, go back. And if this is what you want to do. And so I did do that. And I think then my advisor just really understood this is what I wanted to do. But really at the time, there just wasn't a lot of work being done in this area. Chris Kelty was one of the few anthropologists doing kind of work in this area. So it just felt really exciting because it was sort of uncharted at the time.
Yeah, and we talked about this a little bit last night, but like what anthropology or ethnographers really do classically is like there's place, and place is important, and being somewhere is important. And we sometimes thought that like, and I feel this as well in my work where I work digitally, is that like, hey, the digital space is not a place. Like you have to go somewhere. And that's also, I feel that from some anthropologists and ethnographers, that's kind of the approach a little bit. And why is that? And I'm also curious, why is it so traditionally looked at as like that? Do you know what I mean?
I think it's field work, where anthropology has always been based on going somewhere, being somewhere, and being somewhere for a long time, right?
But like sitting in a like chat room or in a space, why is that not being in a place? You know what I mean? That's also a place.
It is. And I think anthropology has always not only been place-oriented, but then place combined with a region of the world, right? So like Asia or the Amazon. And so chat room just doesn't have that, right? And there is a way, place in that more traditional sense really does matter for hackers insofar as, you go to the Chaos Computer Club conference or camp, and it's such a different vibe from Black Hat in Las Vegas, right? And so in that sense, there's certain aspects of like the hacker world where that place and region in that more traditional anthropological sense really matters. And then there's other elements where it matters less, precisely because digital technologies do allow groups of people to come together and in some ways partially overcome those regional places.
How did you find, so I take it you were hanging out in places like chat rooms and message boards and places like, how'd you find them? And, how did you think about doing research? What did research look like for you at that time?
So with my first project, which was on free and open source software, chat rooms, IRC, Internet Relay Chat was quite important. And I basically would park myself in a chat room and just spend a lot of time chatting with people, following conversations. But mailing lists were important too, in a pretty dramatic way, just because that is also where a very kind of deliberate form of conversation would unfold. And so I would have to read quite a bit of that as well. And then probably the third place was the conference. So I studied Debian, a very large free software project, and going to their yearly conference, which was like Hacker Camp, Meet Academic Conference, right? Really also just changed how I saw everything. In the world of open source, it was relatively easy to get access just because, they're predicated on this idea of openness and transparency. And doesn't mean that their projects are open to everyone, but they do value sort of access. And so it was relatively easy to gain access, even though I do think people were skeptical of me and what I might produce. With my second project on Anonymous, that was pretty much all online until later in the project. And there, it was almost exclusively on chat rooms, IRC as well as like social media. And there were spaces that were easy to access, but there it felt much harder to kind of gain the trust of people compared to something like open source.
And I'm just wondering also, should we fast forward? Because I'm curious. I mean, people know your book. I think, like Lee, you're asking this question of they don't know the amazing Hoaxer book, or like I'm sure the people who are listening are also kind of hacker studies aficionados as well to this podcast right now. But I'm also wondering if people are now getting into it at the moment, what has changed? Like, where would people go? Like, are you still going to CCC in Germany? Are you still people going to these conferences? Are you still hanging out on like Discord channels or whatever? Or I'm just curious and I guess it brings us to our next question of really what's happening at the moment. But yeah, what has changed since those, I guess, 15, 20 years since you've done this?
In the hacker world.
In the hacker world, or more like, let's even start with if you were a PhD student and you want to get into something, like where do you start? That's also I'm wondering.
Well, first of all, I think one thing is that, this was the case when I was working as well, maybe a little bit less so, but certainly more so. There's so many on-ramps and places to study computer hacking.
Yeah.
Whether it's, blockchain or biohackers or, open source, security, right? And in some ways, while when I started, there were very few people and that has like changed, it still feels like there's these areas that are not being kind of looked at ethnographically. There's people absolutely looking at the blockchain world ethnographically, right?
Bug bounty stuff. Some people are doing
bug bounty programs, right? And so in that sense, there's people out there with their hands in the cookie pot. That said, I think we could stand for more ethnographic work in these areas. And then I think one interesting thing is much of the hacker world has been liberal, libertarian, progressive, or anarchist. But today, we also have darker sides, much darker sides to technology, right? And here I'm thinking of things like the Dark Enlightenment with Peter Thiel and just certain groups of people in Silicon Valley who, really question the idea of democracy or enlightenment. And these worlds and the people behind them have a lot of power, but they're really, really hard to access, right? So that is one big change. Maybe that dark streak has always been there and we didn't know about it, but something really shifted in the last 10 years where there's been that block, right? And then another kind of, and this points to, we were talking about this, Paula, about like the limits of the California ideology as a framework. It's like a good starting point in certain ways, but there's all these sort of microcultures, even of Silicon Valley, where the effective altruists, for example, are, maybe problematic for different reasons, but they're very different from the Dark Enlightenment folks, But even effective altruists can be very hard to access because a lot of these people just move in these extremely elite and wealthy circles, right? And so while, there's been a lot of continuity in terms of some activist sort of nodes in the hacker world or open source, I think the sort of three worlds, the dark enlightenment, the effective altruists, I think would probably be a little bit easier to study just because, again, they're just like, we're trying to do good in the world, right? And we're doing it very rationally and so on and so forth. And so you would think that they'd want people to study them. And then I think, the worlds of LLMs and artificial intelligence and AGI, that could also be quite hard to access in terms of just the labs and the sort of work you did, right, inside the kind of corporate world. And those, I think, are really important to study, but there's huge challenges in terms of access.
And can I just do a little comment, Lee, or did you want to jump in? Am I allowed?
No. You keep going. You go for it.
No, just because for our listeners, I guess, also those of us who haven't studied hacking, when Biella speaks of hacking or the stuff that she's also done, hacking has all sorts of definitions, and it's just worth saying for those of us who don't understand that world, it's totally cool, but it's more from even hackers can just be guys at a hackathon in some Saturday corporate whatever junction at Microsoft. That's a hacker, but not maybe they define themselves as hacking, building and tinkering and doing something quickly just to have a prototype. That's hacking stuff together. Or the other side of really infiltrated and secretive systems, and that's kind of security. And then we talk of these black hat hackers and all sorts of worlds. So there's all sorts. This is a gamma, but there's, I don't know, 50 of different types of what hacking means. I don't know if we won't get into all the definitions.
Right.
Just a disclaimer is what.
No. And it also things like the dark enlightenment, I wouldn't characterize those guys as hackers, but hackers move in tech worlds that are adjacent to those worlds. And some individuals in those worlds might be like, I'm a hacker, and others might not be. But what I do think is interesting is, again, if you think of something like the world of open source or the Chaos Computer Club, they really do have some classical liberal commitments that includes things like, democracy and enlightenment. And you can criticize those in all sorts of ways, but I do think it's so important to then differentiate it from other tech worlds like the dark enlightenment, where they're like, we want to kind of return to a neo-feudal order, right? But when you study hacking, again, because a lot of hackers are in places like Berlin, London, the Bay Area, then in places like the Bay Area, you have these tech adjacent worlds that I think, are, even threatening to kind of hacker sensibilities.
I had a question. So the your first book, Coding Freedom, had this subtitled "The Ethics and Aesthetics of Hacking," and I see that kind of I just wanted you to kind of talk through why those two terms kind of bubbled up in your research, because I think they also apply to the anonymous book, and there's maybe a different ethic and aesthetic there, but right? And so I just wondered why those two terms came forward for you as the way to think about what these folks were up to and how they thought about themselves.
Yeah, great questions. And you're totally right. You could have applied ethics and aesthetics to anonymous, but they just are different, not necessarily radically different, but different. So in terms of free and open source software, I was just struck by the way in which these guys were not simply creating technology, but were debating things like licenses in relation to sort of the history of free speech law in the United States. Or when they, in the case again of Debian, the project itself had an incredibly complex governance system where newcomers had to take legal and ethical tests in order to gain access to the project, not simply technical tests. or there would be big sort of ethical debates about how they govern themselves. And so that's where the ethical questions came up and governance. And it was often ethics in terms of their own productive freedom and autonomy. And they did, care about broader questions of access and knowledge. But it was also a lot of these ethical questions and production was sort of inward focus as well. In terms of aesthetics, this came up actually through the question of humor, where
nice.
at a certain point, I was like, oh my God, these guys are really funny. They're always cracking jokes. And there was this one particular moment where I think I was at some sort of like technical event, and the speaker was interrupted by one of the participants who like cracked a joke. And I was like, oh, that doesn't happen very often. When you're at a conference, a speaker will often crack a joke, but to have an audience member interrupt the speaker with a joke felt, kind of interesting and unusual. And so I got interested in this question of humor. And I really saw that in some ways, the history of hacking and the different genres of hacking, the hacker underground, the phone freaks, free software, they all had this kind of aesthetic sensibility of craftiness, a willingness to sort of bend rules, engage in humor. And it really just felt everywhere. And it was one of the things that kind of differentiated hackers from other types of engineers who engage in a similar type of labor and craft. And so that's where the aesthetics came about.
that's
and so
nice.
and I was really interested in that too as an anthropologist. So that's where the ethics and aesthetics came about for my first project. In the second project with Anonymous, the ethics of Anonymous were interesting because, many of the Anonymous participants were anti-surveillance, pro-privacy, pro-free speech. And that's similar to the open source world. But they're also people Anonymous were willing to kind of break the law as well, at least some of them, right? And in that sense, very, very different. And then the aesthetics there was a craftiness as well. But then you had the whole sort of Guy Fawkes imagery, which was a very different type of visual aesthetic. But the kind of visual culture of Anonymous was also something very interesting, not something I wrote a ton about, but I think that's another element that was very present and so different from the aesthetics of open source, where it's just like, if you go to a project's open source page, it's just like text,
Right.
Right. Anyway, so there's just so much to play with around this question of ethics and aesthetics. And it's something I often return to, even with different projects.
And can I jump in about aesthetics? Because I'd like to talk about hats. Different colored hats.
Yeah,
Good
we were going to go there. So
segue.
yeah, do that.
It's a good segue. I like hats. No, because you are, we'd like to talk, I think, with Lee about the professionalization of hacking with you, and your most recent article for Data and Society with Matt Gorsman, also shout out to Matt, is also about wearing different hats and really what happens when hackers go from like sort of the underground or tinkering and enjoying their craft on whatever weekends and evenings to like really professionalizing. And for those also of us who don't study hacking, we've heard this term black hat, white hat. What are these hats all about? Can you tell us a bit more about the hats? And do people still define themselves as this? Tell us a bit. So this is a many-part question, I guess, but tell us a bit more.
Tell us about hats.
Tell us about hats.
Yeah.
What hats do you like wearing?
So in the sort of security hacker world, so different from open source, historically a little bit less so today, hackers will describe themselves, or the media will describe hackers as wearing black hat, white hat, or gray hat. And just, they're drawing on the sort of common sense moral connotations of colors, where black might be bad, white might be good, and gray is somewhere in between, right? But it's so much more actually complicated than even that, right? And certainly, these terms are still in operation. For example, I was at Black Hat, which is a really important security corporate conference that happens before DEF CON, right? And Matt and I, hi Matt, who's wonderful, who works on the history of security and vulnerabilities, we're interested in two things around the hats. First of all, really their historical genesis, like where do they come from? And then what sort of moral work did they do? So I'll maybe start with the latter and then go to the former. So there was a period of time where there was a thriving underground hacker scene, Australia, Europe, North America. And a lot of these hackers, sometimes now referred to as black hat hackers, but non-malicious black hat hackers. At the time, they tended to refer to themselves as kind of underground hackers, were breaking into systems for sort of joy and status and edification. They were part of little groups called Tezo, the Hacker's Choice, ADM, Loft, and they were breaking the law. I mean, just straight up breaking the law, right?
The law.
Breaking the law. And learning a lot and learning a ton about security. And then at a certain point in the sort of early 90s, as, computers became more common and security became an issue to contend with, some of these hackers were like, we have the expertise and knowledge to secure systems, and we would actually like to leave the underground and basically contribute to security cultures, to the industry, to the very nascent industry. And one of the things that happened when some of these individuals started to kind of make a case for themselves or seek jobs was that other people, like some academics, like Gene Spafford, a professor of computer science, was like, don't trust these guys. Would you hire an arsonist to be a firefighter? Was basically his argument. They're untrustworthy because they had broken the law. And then other folks like Dorothy Denning was like, well, let me actually not just pronounce this. Let me actually do some research. She did some research among them. She's also a computer scientist. She's like, well, actually, they have a strong sense of ethics. They want to do right. And of course, there might be individuals that you may not want to hire because they're untrustworthy. But generally, many of them seem to really want to help and have the skills and are trustworthy. And so through the 1990s, a lot of these underground hackers engaged in linguistic and cultural and technical labor to kind of convince various publics that they were credible, trustworthy, and they had the technical skills to do this work. And in the end, they kind of, won. But now back to the hats. As this was going on, like some of these hackers were being kind of framed, the ones that then left the shadows and started to work in the industry were starting to be framed as white hat hackers. And then those that kind of remain in the underground were being deemed black hats. And there were then also like criminal black hats who weren't like part of the scene. But what's so interesting is gray hat started to be used as a kind of term to sort of say, no, we came from the black hat world. That's where we got our skills. And we like that scene and it's valuable. So no, we're not white hats, right?
I see.
Exactly. And there was and this was so interesting for those that do research. It was so hard to kind of like figure out when the term gray hat, started to really like the sort of provenance of gray hat. And there's probably multiple provenances, but there was one very important moment where a member of the Loft, Mudge, heard that IBM was starting to hire hackers, but only sort of ethical white hat hackers. That's when he's like, no, gray hat. Because before, when he would give talks, he's like, we're not black hats, we're not white hats, but he never used like the term gray. There was that moment where IBM was like, we'll only touch those white hats. And he's like, but a lot of the people with the best skills came from the black hat world.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And so then that term gray hat kind of came into being. So we look at those hats in terms of that history, and then today it is still being kind of used. I think like most hackers wouldn't come out and be like, "Yeah, I'm a white hat or gray hat," you know what I mean? Because it's a little passé today.
Yeah.
But it's still part of the cultural imaginary. And again, there's like the conference, like black hat, right? And it goes back to that ethics question, right? It's just these colors are being used to sort of signal not only ethical positions, but kind of origins in terms of where skills were learned, right? Pride, in terms of certain roots, and moral uprightness as well. That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, that was great. And you got us going on some of the things we wanted to ask you about anyway. So I'm glad we started with the hats. That was good. Can I just ask you, before we go on with kind of professionalization, which we want to ask you more about, can I just ask you a bit about how these folks see you at this point? Like, I imagine it was hard to see, like you said earlier, it was hard to get trust. And that's what I even had it in the questions here, I think. Like, I would imagine, especially with anonymous and stuff, getting trust from these folks would be very difficult. But now you've been going to these conferences for, 20 years, some of them? And so is it like now, there's Biella over in the corner, like, yeah, like, is it like, yeah, what's it like?
I mean, I suspect there might be different views.
Yeah, I'm sure there
Not
are.
all
Yeah.
positive.
We've been to CCC in Germany together. That's we've been together.
Yeah, that was great.
I think you're just a bit of a legend. I mean, people don't know how you always look like, right? So they're not like running with autographs behind her, right?
They're like, wow, she's short.
She's
like Paula.
massively tall. Exactly. We look like funny. Yeah.
I mean, I think I certainly have been kind of around for a long time, and because of that, for example, the black hat, gray hat, white hat project would not have been possible 15 years ago for two reasons, one of which I think some of the people who had been part of the black hat scene were not willing to talk about their past, but they then certainly wouldn't be willing to talk to just anybody. And so that really came about, by sticking around and doing a lot of work. And so that's just a really, really good example of how just sticking to a single topic. I don't like to say single topic because there's all these genres of hacking. And that's why I want to get to that in a moment. It certainly helps, right? On the other hand, I mean, one of the great things is like studying open source, anonymous security hackers. I was just like, wow, there's a lot of differences and similarities in these worlds, right? And I think like if I had just stayed studying open source, I would not have seen that. And so there's been something really, really valuable about kind of jumping around in the hacker world. And I even want to do more of it in terms of like different regions of the world. But that also comes with a cost as well, right? And so recently someone wrote me with some information about Debian, and they're like, as the Debian historian. And I was like, well, I'm not, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in some ways I wish I were. And if I didn't have a job teaching and someone just wanted to independently fund me, just putting that idea out there, I would actually have a lot more continuity with some of these worlds, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
right?
Sure.
So, and I sometimes feel like there's a certain type of feeling of loss and guilt at some level where you're like, okay, I studied Debian hardcore for 5 years, but then kind of moved on. And then I will, if the right Debian conference comes around, I might go to it, right? And I love kind of going back to communities or events related to things I've once studied, right? Anyway, so I feel that tension a little bit where on the one hand, I am a classic anthropologist who has remained in a kind of general world for a very, very long time. And that has just been interpersonally and professionally and intellectually really productive, generative, and amazing. And yet again, because there is so much in the hacker world, I also feel like I've jumped around a lot. So
I get it. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But I love how some like Gen Z, like Debian girl came up to you being like, "You're the historian." You're like, "No, I just studied it 20 years ago. That just was current at the time." The former anthropologist, now historian. No,
Exactly.
no,
Exactly.
But it is also really fragmented. But I would say that like when we were at this conference, having anyone study a community, like you have a talk and I gave a talk there, and they're just really grateful, right? They're like, wow, there's people that actually study this to take the time, and then it's just as Biella said at the beginning, it's like few and far between. People don't actually go in and go in as deeply for a few years of time to really, really study, really get to know the community. That's very different from like a journalist coming in for like a week or whatever. That's a
No, I
shout
think
out to
that's
all
a great
ethnographers.
point. And we were at CCC presenting Hack Curio, which is like this video museum.
Check it out if you want.
Yeah.
Plugging it. It's a wonderful. If you don't know what we're talking about, just go on to Hack Curio, and you'll find out all sorts of things about different types of hackers and hacking. It's a
And
little
it's
sort of museum
video
online.
based.
Exactly.
And you know, to your point, it was sort of like we did this partially to give back something to the hacker world in a hackery sort of way, right? And the videos are related to all sorts of different domains of hacking.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
We try
But
to
it's a
not
good
leave
teaching
people
tool.
out.
Also plugging that. Please check it out. Yeah, but let's talk more about professionalization. No, Lee?
Yeah, I think that's good. I mean, so, how do you think about the professionalization of these worlds? If I heard you right earlier, and please correct me if I didn't, it sounded to me like there were cyber security communities that had grown up in CS that were not hacking based, that had their own identity and were kind of policing the boundaries with these other characters they thought were suspicious, right? So tell us a story about how hacking kind of professionalizes in that context.
No, you did hear me right. Maybe one or two contextual things. In the academy, cybersecurity was pretty marginal. And so there weren't a lot of academics or departments that really specialized in it. So Purdue was one of these places where security was really important. But this was one of the problems was if you were interested in security, like you didn't necessarily go to the academy to learn. It was few and far between, right? So that's one contextual element. The other one that is very interesting too is that, today we have just tons of cybersecurity companies, but that wasn't the case in the 70s and 80s and much of the 90s. And security happened in like insurance companies and audit firms, and there were some pen testers that were hired in these places, right? And so there was just like sort of contextual conditions that then help explain why these underground hackers who did have a lot of knowledge around security because of the ways in which they were breaking into systems. That's a great way to learn about security flaws and then how to fix them. Why they were well positioned to both be hired when that industry started to take off and also to help establish that industry, right? So had there been a pretty robust academic sphere or robust corporate sphere around security, and you had this underground, I think it would have been harder for them to break into it. So that's kind of the material conditions. That said, again, they were breaking the law, many of them, right? And as security became important, and one of the interesting things too is that some of these hackers actually helped put security on the map. It wasn't that academics and others, like there were a lot of individuals in Microsoft who were quite concerned with security. But nevertheless, some of these hackers who were outside of these institutions were sort of sounding the alarm. And so they had a very antagonistic relationship to Microsoft, for example, in the 1990s, saying like, we really could break your password system. And publicly, Microsoft was like, well, there's not a problem. You're the problem. And the hackers were like, no, the problem is that we can do this. And there was like this back and forth, right? And so also just how security was conceived of as a problem was partially defined by some of these underground hackers who were sort of saying, no, you need to do a better job at how you build your technologies, how you find these bugs, right? Which was just like so fascinating and part of the professionalizing process. But you could see how it could put them at risk. They're outlaws. They're being antagonistic to Microsoft. But on the other hand, they have a lot of skills and they were willing to teach others. They were willing to testify in the government. The Loft testified in 1998. They were a hacker group claiming that they could take down the internet in 30 minutes. So they were just doing sort of a lot of labor to kind of convince various publics that there was a problem and that they can kind of fix the problem as well. Two very interesting things related to this kind of process of professionalization. One is that there was a period of time that some companies would hire hackers, but would really put pressure on them not to say they were hackers. Or these hackers would be hired, let's say at HP, and then they would go to DEF CON, this hacker conference, but they could not share any photo that they had been there, right? So there was this period of time where professionalizing was happening underground, at some level. And then that ended. It's like you could, wear your hacker badge with pride. Another really interesting part of this history, and Matt Gorzen has written a lot about this, is related to how you disclose vulnerabilities. So there was various mailing lists, the full disclosure mailing list, bug track, really important watering holes for discussing kind of technical issues around vulnerabilities. But again, initially, one of the things that hackers did to pressure companies to care about security was they would publish information full disclosure around vulnerabilities. It's pissed off a lot of companies, and a lot of people in the security world were just like, now like criminals can, take advantage of these systems, and they were right. But from the hacker perspective at the time, they're like, well, if we don't publish this, you are not going to be forced to fix it. And I kind of side with the hackers at that time period, right? It's sort of like did provide a kick in the ass to the companies to really start taking it seriously. And so then that full disclosure kind of movement morphed into what's called coordinated disclosure, responsible disclosure, where you kind of notify the company before you notify the public, right? So that was also very antagonistic at some level. And so here these guys, because they were mostly guys with some exceptions, sort of saying, trust us, we're good at this, but F you, your security sucks, and we're publishing these vulnerabilities, right? So it's not just that they had the skills and no one else was around, right? There really was a lot of this sort of back and forth kind of work that went into the process of making them credible as this security industry started to establish itself.
Yeah, it's just, can I jump in, Lee, for a second?
Oh, yeah.
It also just starts confusing me in terms of like what came first, the chicken or the egg in this situation, because you also wrote that hackers in this article with Matt, that hackers with a history of breaking into systems were well positioned to take advantage of this tremendous financial and government interest in security. They had laid the foundation to do so. And it almost seems like there's just a group of people who are almost creating problems or showing where the problems are or making problems and then being like, guys, hire us to fix this, or being like, I don't want to get hired to fix this, that's selling out, or there's so much contradiction in this and it's so complicated. Actually, it sounds, it's hard to entangle maybe if you're not in this world, but it's a bit bizarre that this world of professionalizing has, I guess, many hats.
It does. No, and there were, I love this because there were some critics too who were sort of like, yeah, there's some weird perverse incentives here of like people who causing the problems can fix the problems, right? And there's some truth to that. But it's also the case that, the underground that professionalized, they did tend to have like pretty strong ethical protocols not to profit from what they were doing. And that wasn't necessarily going to be the case as other people learned these skills, and they could see that, right? But there were critics who were just like, yeah, there's some really perverse
from
circular from not so much the underground, but security folks who were working at the same time. And then there was a backlash against professionalization, and there was a group called Anti-Sec that was really upset that people were professionalizing, and for reasons again that are kind of complex at times, or people had sort of different ideas. But one main kind of driving force behind Anti-Sec was that it was really fun to be part of the underground, and you had secret knowledge, and it's sort of like you got to climb Everest by yourselves. And now all of a sudden that pristine world, and by pristine, it's sort of like a world of status and intellectual edification, is going to be gone. And it kind of did go away, right?
It's now a queue of people trying to climb the Mount Everest.
Exactly.
And falling off under this.
And one person we interviewed used that language,
okay.
And it's true. If you go look at Everest, when people climb, it's like the queue looks horrible. It's just like, who wants to do that, right?
Yeah,
exactly.
And anyone who experienced the pristine Everest, right? You see what I'm saying?
Good metaphor. Yeah.
Yeah. And, it's also a commitment to a certain type of elitism as well, right? So, yeah, and some of those anti-sec people would then hack some of the professionalizing hackers to show that they weren't so good at security.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You think you're good, buddy, but I'll show you.
I have to tell a little side story, and then we can get back. One of the fascinating things about the history of hacking and leaking from a kind of hacktivist perspective is that there's a hacker named Jeremy Hammond, who was one of the most kind of active members of Anonymous, and an anarchist, anti-capitalist, kind of surveillance police hacker who spent 10 years in jail for his hacking. He was part of the underground, and then was like, wow, that kind of anti-sec hacking and leaking, it's like, it's kind of done for lame reasons, but politically or from a sort of direct action perspective is pretty badass. And so he then started to later on hack and leak, but against the powerful. And he had kind of learned it from these anti-sec people, but reformatted it in a very, very different way. And it's just so interesting to see how but it only really came into being once like WikiLeaks was around, where he's sort of like, oh, I can do this hack and leak thing that I had learned from anti-sec, but for like politically progressive purposes. And then when he joined Anonymous, he named a little Operation Anti-Sec, which is very different from the first one, right? And so you could see how these worlds, like the security hacker underground, is really different from the hacktivist world. But nevertheless, like Hammond kind of drew inspiration from that anti-sec world to do something very different with it.
When you were talking about this antagonism and the leaking of bugs and things like this, I went back to ethics and aesthetics, and I was thinking about I have a bunch of techie IT friends who are not hackers by identity, right? But when they find bugs or like shitty work in the products of these big firms like Microsoft and stuff, it like pisses them off at like the deepest gut. It's like a form of disgust or something. It's like, it's more aesthetic. I mean, it's also ethical, but it's like, it really hits them in the belly. And it angers them so much that like, I have one friend who'll just dump code into our Signal chat, even though the rest of the guys in they don't know what's going on, right? Because we're not those guys. But he has to like vomit it out somewhere, you know? He's like anger. And I was just thinking about like whether like that's part of the motivation here. It's like, Microsoft, you are fucking up and it is ridiculous, right? Like, do your job. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, no, absolutely, and that's something that's sort of like the craft ethic. Like, do a good job, do it well, right? And this is something that in the hacker world is really, really important. Whether it's open source or the security guys, right? There is a lot of like pride in doing good work, right? And I think among a lot of sort of like techie types, not just hackers, right? And this is something that, you know, I think Paula has also seen in her work.
But I think that's where like then you sort of just get old and you're like into good enoughness and you just work at like Microsoft and some
it's probably a
team.
Personality thing, right? I mean, some people are
personality and also burnout
burnout, and you just have to go pick up your kids from daycare or whatever.
Exactly.
You're just like, I'm not into like perfection anymore.
It's also interesting if you go to the jargon file. It's a compendium of hacker lore and definitions, and hack is so interesting because I think it's got like 11 or 12 definitions, but 2 are diametrically opposed. One is like a quick and dirty job that does a job but not well,
Hack
and the other
together.
is like a stunning intervention that, you know, took so long to do and is sort of really amazing. And I think they're related. Like, you have to do one in order to get to 2 often, right? Yeah. If you're always looking for perfection right away, you'll get like paralyzed. This is actually Richard Sennett in his book, The Craftsman, has a nice thing on this sort of dynamic. But the hacker world does tend to try to push for exceptional stuff at some level, right? In practice, you know, that doesn't always happen. And I do think also like real world working conditions.
Sure.
Whether it's in a free software project or at a corporation, right?
Here you don't have like week 44 and you have to like, whatever, you have a schedule, you have a customer, you have a manager.
Right.
Like, I think in hacking, if you have the dynamic of the manager, I think the sort of good enoughness and I'll just do a half-half job is a lot in contention with, it's just like your own struggle as a laborer as well. You try to use that to push back against that. Even though a lot of hackers, let's say not hackers, like kind of programmers who work at corporations, they want to do a good job, but sometimes they're like, you know, double, you know, middle fingers to your manager because then I'm going to just do good enough. So it is a very different dynamic, I think, if you work in a corporation than if you're just like a part of a hacker collective working both underground or not. I don't know. No, wouldn't you say that?
Yeah, no, for sure. But there's also, I think, like a third point where what is the right solution? That's something funny with like hackers who are really into like doing the best thing. Like they'll often really disagree as well.
Sure.
Right.
Yes.
But I think like bad work in the way that you were talking about, where it's just like, oh man, that's ugly and terrible. You know what I mean? And like offensive, right? And I mean, I think we've all felt that too in our own worlds. But then also if you think about, I think about, the actual conditions of people working. And I'm like, oh my God, people have to publish so much to get tenure. I don't, you know, of course, some of these articles maybe are not going to be the best, right?
But I want to be in that Telegram group. Put us in. Or whatever WhatsApp group.
With Signals,
right?
Yeah. Maybe we should talk about LLMs for a second as we kind of head towards winding down. And you know, Paul and I were just wondering, you know, like if generative AI and LLMs are really showing up in these worlds and like how and what it means to them, these groups.
Yeah. So generative AI is showing up in really different ways in these worlds. So maybe I'll just point to a couple for those that might be interested, and this is kind of good domains for studying. I mean, one is that people are learning how to hack. Another is that they're hacking AGI, right? To do things that they're not supposed to do. And that's like a very classic security intervention, right? And a really important role for hackers. And it's fun. I mean, I think even just us individuals will sometimes try to do that, right? Try to trick the program into just doing something it's not supposed to do. But this is really a serious thing. And there is kind of competitions at these hacker conferences for this. So that's kind of another domain. Then the third one, I mean, this was really interesting at Black Hat. I went to a talk by Chris Weissapal, who's a member of the Loft, one of these hacker groups that professionalized, and he's the CTO of a company he founded, Veracode, which does security scanning. And they're using kind of LLMs to improve their own systems. But what was so interesting about the talk, and unsurprising at some level, is if you use these systems without like the full awareness of their weaknesses, they will cause more problems. Like you really, really have to use them as a tool with total limits. And if that makes sense. And those kind of teams or entities that use these tools, putting too much faith in them, will produce as many security vulnerabilities in code as teams that don't use them. But if you use them as a kind of adjuvant and a tool with a full awareness of their weaknesses and train them accordingly, then they can kind of be powerful. And I think that's the same, let's just say, for us in the social sciences and humanities. If you want to use it for writing and editing, it can't replace your writing. If
or
you
judgment,
want, or judgment, and especially judgment, right? But if you sort of want to okay, you've written something, feed it in, edit it, and then you re-edit it, you might get something better. But if you just sort of feed it in and say, improve on this, I don't know, you'll introduce a lot of mistakes. I mean, I think what's interesting to me is like some people are of the camp that generative AI will one day really be autonomous to do that sort of more technical work, or let's just say editing work, because it's in its early stages. I'm skeptical of that, just because the human mind is so complicated. And you know what I mean? Intelligence is it's so multifaceted, has so many things. You know, we could pick up tone and gesture, right? See certain types of patterns that I would love to hear what you two think. I'm skeptical that computers can do that work. So I could see it as a powerful tool, but not like as a kind of replacement for intelligence.
Skeptical. I just also love, imagine it like completely replaces this work in like 2 months. This podcast will not age well. It'll just totally not age.
I hedge my bets. I'm trying to be careful.
Yeah.
But, you know, I would add to that. I mean, I think like Gary Marcus and other folks in that world really think that this, you know, what happens in AI very often is you have a new technique develop, it goes up, but it doesn't keep going up. It just plateaus, and they think we're already there more or less, you know. And it's noteworthy that new versions of ChatGPT haven't come out, even though they've been talking about doing it for a long time. So I think it's further evidence that we're not getting spikes in improvement. We'll get small ones.
Right.
And then if that's true, then I totally agree with your analysis. It sounds exactly right to me.
But I think in work cultures also, because I dabbled a little bit in research around programmers using different LLM tools, and which we talked about with Biella a few days ago, is that the more expertise you have, the more useful these tools are.
Yes,
and people forget about the I think that's the little hypothesis I had, and other people are having this hypothesis, right? And then like, you just kind of think that, okay, I'm going to come in, I'm going to be a hacker and unhack things into, you know, and use these tools. And that's not how it really works if you're just like very junior. And whether you're a junior writer and you're an undergrad student, or if you're an actual starting out, I don't know, security hacker working for whoever, it's still going to be just very difficult. You know what I mean? So the more expertise you have, the more useful it is, I think, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And then the question is whether those without deep expertise can use it to gain expertise, right? And I know with writing, unless you're writing initially without it, no. But if you then, but this is where, okay, one last thing around this. So one of the things I really actually like about LibreOffice, Google Docs, the format I don't like in Microsoft is if I edit someone's work, you could really see it nicely with the slashes, replacements. Again, with Microsoft Word, visually, I don't think is as good, but at least you could sort of see what's being done. That teaches people.
That's how I learned in grad school from my advisor, who was a great editor and teacher of writing. Yeah.
Exactly. When I first started to be edited, I was like, wow, you know, and then I do it to others. ChatGPT doesn't do that. It just changes it, right? Yeah. And of course you could sort of like track it and trace it in your own mind, but it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
Of course you could imagine a sort of interface where it does, where it's a lot more interactive and it teaches you, because that is where I mean, if AGI can start teaching people in those ways to become experts, and then you could use the tools in the ways you were talking about, but that step is really important.
Yeah, totally.
Right? To become a programmer, to become a writer, to become an editor of video, right? These are really important skills to sort of develop.
I just wanted to say that I think the literature, like the sociologists and folks who are studying the use of these systems, like Matt Bean and others, are finding exactly what you were saying earlier, Paula, that it really rewards expertise. Those, like, it's again and again where people are finding this, that it's the experts who get the most out of the systems, and then the role they can play in training is an open question that we'll see. Biella, yeah, what's next for you? I mean, one thing I love about you remind me of my friend Alex Wellerstein, the nuclear historian to some degree, because you've been in this world, right? And you're going to keep going. There's things that still fascinate you. And for that reason, like a really deep kind of body of work comes out of that. So tell us if the other hacking stuff you want to get into. But when I met you in Boston, you were really into mold. And I was like, all right, you were really jazzed up. And you were like, and so like, I always wondered, like, I mean, I know that you got into mold because you had experience with it, and you know, but it also seemed to really fascinate you. So I wondered if you're going to do some critical mold studies, maybe start a new journal.
CMS. So I really do. I'm wrapping up two books around the hacker stuff. One with Matt Gorson, one a book of essays. And once I'm done with that, and/or I'm in a stable house, I really do want to do a project on mold. And it's a sort of like, I think, going to be a mix of sort of investigative journalism, STS, disability studies, and medical anthropology. Cool. And I'm definitely an individual that has been really impacted physically, health-wise by mold. It makes me very, very sick. And one of the things about mold, especially in the United States, is that there's a lot of it. There's a lot in homes, and it's hidden. It's often hidden behind drywall, and, you know, because of leaky pipe, or the house was built incorrectly and the insulation behind your wall is really moldy and people don't know. And a portion of people, and, you know, we don't really know why, do get quite sick from it, right? And it's one of these kind of interesting conditions that, you know, even something like chronic fatigue syndrome or long COVID is like more medically recognized at some level. And I mean, there is a recognition that mold and mycotoxins are dangerous. The World Health Organization, for example, has specifications of how much mycotoxins can be in food, for example, because it will kill you with enough mycotoxins. And of course, Europe has better standards than the United States. But But it's one of these sort of like conditions that a group of sort of functional or integrative doctors will recognize, but a lot of mainstream doctors won't. So you're sort of, really having to sort of navigate very difficult medical territory to get it recognized. And then there's like the housing side of it, right?
Yes.
Where because so much of it is hidden, it really, really is this kind of uphill battle to often prove it because you have to kind of, test and rip things open. And I think it's sort of inherently a problem with a lot of American housing. And then there's a lot of financial pressures and reasons to like not make it a problem to deal with, just because the cost of dealing with this problem is so huge, right? And so there's almost like this collective denial at some level that I think is going on. But, and this is, also where I have a lot of commitment and passion and worry, which is around climate change, right? And we are just having more and more water events, floods, extreme rains. And so I actually do think, and let's see if this ages well or not, but I do think in the next 5 to 10 years, this will be put on the map simply by virtue of these flooding events, because American housing from an infrastructural perspective cannot handle floods in the way that, for example, I grew up in Puerto Rico. Everything's made out of cement. And so you could have like a major flood, and then after the flood, rip out the wood in the house, but the structure is cement and it withstands it.
Huh. Interesting.
And so, and you really have seen people who really do start to get sick after the flood. So they know it's the mold, right? Anyway, so there's just all these elements. I know I'm just sort of like blurted all this stuff.
It just made me also, if I just add one thing, it made me think of how to also loop in your work, Lee, around maintenance and repair, because I find it interesting because when you talk about housing and mold, it's almost like there's a space between maintenance and repair and like full innovation. Let's cut down the house. Let's like build something new. There's also this like moment where you just ignore the problems there. We're not going to maintain it. We don't know how to repair. We don't know how to clean it. We don't know how to do anything with it, but we don't want to cut down, like totally demolish this house. This is a house. This is a huge infrastructure. This is a building. This is a office space. This is whatever. So you just have this like trap in between maintenance and repair and innovation.
No, I think that's a great point. And I mean, part of the problem when you don't have like a catastrophe, you can just have one bad leak. And if you don't fix it correctly, like open the drywall, take the insulation out, let it dry, you will have this little festering problem. If you just fixed it correctly, it would not be a problem, right? But it's sort of like part of it is just people don't always know, right? Like, and then part of it is materials. Again, I mean, concrete is very bad from a carbon perspective. But if you do build with concrete and then put the insulation outside, right? I mean, yes, you can still have a slow leak and it affects things, but it's a very different calculus. So it's also really interesting from an STS, like materials perspective.
Yeah, totally.
Materials, norms, what do you do? And then also, I mean, there's been all these books about like fungus in the sort of positive register.
Oh, yeah. I remember. Yeah. I remember you saying this at Boston now. It's like, what? So do your version.
I want to do like one that's the kind of opposite. It's like dark fungus,
Dark fungus. Yeah, exactly.
It's like, it's not going to make you feel good.
Yeah.
But I mean, fungus is amazing.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
Like the ability to regenerate life, decay, and kill. And make you crazy. I mean, like, and liberate your mind. I mean, it really is this amazing entity, right?
Totally.
Maybe mold is a hacker.
It kind of is,
mold spores as the OG hackers.
Exactly. So hopefully, I'm sort of in the process of.
No, we're convinced. This is going to be a cool book. No, it's great. I love it, and I think Yeah, I think it gets into some very interesting spaces of, like people's homes and decision to renovate or not renovate. That's very different than the kind of corporation versus the people kind of dynamic you find in a lot of STSE type analysis, right? So it gets into a lot of interesting decision spaces and cultural spaces. I
No,
think that's good.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And,
Well,
and
this was. Oh, go ahead.
it's so interesting when there's potentially such a profound problem that is hidden.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say this, just in case anyone is listening, like dead mold can still make people like me very sick. But I think, and this goes back to hacking a little bit, I am surprised that there's not technologies which are sensors that you could sort of stick inside walls to basically, monitor different levels of spores and mycotoxins and VOCs. If mold is alive, some of them really emit VOCs. You can make a lot of money and you could help a lot of people if you develop these technologies that would allow people to basically sense, identify, and track mold. So I'm just
I see the smart home app already.
Exactly.
About it. This was so much fun. Thank you, Biella, for coming on. Paula, thank you for thinking of this.
Yes.
Yeah, hug it up.
The creepy hand of God.
This is great.
This way.
Paula, we're going to keep it going. I got more ideas.
You're also nice. Nice to be here. Lovely to have you here, Biella. Thank you.
It's been great. Thank you so much.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.